What role is the strongest in Overwatch 2? When I ask that question, many of you already have an idea for the role in mind, but we're going to break down each role individually and talk about what makes them so strong, when do they feel weak, and ultimately, what is the strongest role, period. We're going to break it all down, but only 20% of you are currently subscribed, so do me a solid and press that subscribe button and let's jump into it. Now, first off, tanking, which is the only role that only has one, and the thing about a tank, which is pretty obvious, but a tank is needed for winning games. Pretty much more than anyone else, you need a tank, and an AFK or super underperforming tank means that you're gonna insta-lose a game. Now, the thing about roles in general is that every role has jobs that they need to accomplish, but the tanking job in particular doesn't have overlap with the other roles, and it's simultaneously the only role that is a solo done role. Now, when you got a job that you need to do for winning and you only have one person that can do it, that role can feel incredibly essential. But my question to you is, tanking being essential make the role strong? Now, what I mean is that something could feel gross, weak, underpowered, but at the same time be incredibly essential. And I really do think that that's where tank sits. Tank is essential before they're strong. Now, that doesn't mean that tank is not strong. I think sometimes, especially in certain situations, they are incredibly strong. There are games where a tank takes over an entire lobby. Doom runs it down, kills everyone. Queen pops off, gets cleave after cleave. Rams are running it down, killing the entire enemy team. These games happen, and in these games, tanks are undoubtedly strong. But I think there's a many more amount of games where a tank is getting bullied. They're getting naded, they're getting slept, they're getting discorded, they're getting booped. They're becoming the target of every piece of utility and fire from the enemy team, and they don't get to do anything that feels strong or really is strong, but they are doing something that only they can do that is essential for winning. So that might make them the strongest character. But before we answer that, let's move on to the DPS. Now, while a tank is 100% needed for winning games straight up, you need a tank that is at the very least present to win a game. DPS is the least important role for a competitive game. And what I mean by that is that an AFK DPS or a DPS that is heavily underperforming is the least likely to cause an instant loss out of any of the roles. Now, does this make DPS weak? Well, let's see. If one falls behind the other, then the other can pick up the slack easier than the other dual role, support. It's a lot harder for that role to do it, which I'll talk about in a bit. Now, the interesting thing about DPS is that a lot of your jobs rely on you directly dealing with or contesting the enemy DPS. And DPS only truly feel lacking when the enemy DPS is absolutely popping off over and over again and left uncontested. This means that in a game where both sides of the DPS equation are just not performing very well, then the DPS role feels very weak and not very impactful and almost irrelevant. That being said though, an uncontested DPS can make a close game only about them. And I know that you've been in those games where there's a certain DPS on the enemy team that just feels like he is not getting dealt with and he's just running through everyone. And we see those all the time. Now, even though I do think that DPS is the role that causes the least insta losses if it's not fulfilled, some heroes in the hands of good players have higher peaks and value ceiling than any other hero, period. Essentially, within those games, when those players pop off that hard, no one can argue that in that moment, they are undoubtedly the strongest. And DPS can feel the most powerful for sure. In a very similar way that tanks sometimes feel very weak, DPS can feel incredibly strong. And my ultimate conclusion to this is that DPS are less essential than tanks, but they can feel or be the strongest person, period, on the battlefield. Now, does that make them the strongest though, always? Is this just peaks in value? And is being essential an important part of being the strongest? I'm gonna answer that question, but before that, let's talk about support. Now, just like tanks, supports feel essential for winning games, but unlike tanks, there are two of them, meaning that they can share the load or the job with each other. That being said though, it is really important for supports to be both accomplishing the job or the job doesn't feel like it's being done. And this is actually a lot different from the DPS, which have a much easier time actually fulfilling each other's weaknesses and each other's gaps in impact. Now, if you don't agree with that statement, here's another that you will agree with. Bad support synergies feel far worse than bad DPS synergies. There are actually a lot of optimal and unoptimal DPS synergies that exist, but those happen all the time, and most people don't even feel them. But the second you are locking a Lucio Mercy, you're gonna feel that bad synergy, and I promise you, someone's gonna say something about it. This is because both halves of the support equation share the load and have a harder time filling each other's gaps in impact. It's almost like a job that y'all have to be doing hand in hand rather than a job that just needs to be done, and it just means one of the DPS have to sign up to do the job and the other one can kind of just do whatever he wants. If you wanted a better analogy, think of like the support role as a big ass log that two people have to carry together to the finish line, while the DPS role is like a whole bunch of little logs that all need to be taken to the finish line, and they can be carried individually, but it would be easier if both of them did it, yes, but it's possible for one of them to do it if he's really scrappy, but it's not possible for one support to carry the big log unless they're literally breaking their back. Now, in addition to that, though, supports actually share a good bit of overlap with DPS and can pick up some of their base jobs. So they're simultaneously trying to carry these big logs over the finish line with the help of the other support, but then they can also carry these tiny logs and help the other DPS that may or may not be slacking off from completing their jobs as well. But conversely, the DPS cannot help the support carry the big ass log. Now, getting away from analogies for a second, the utility in the support role is very unique to the support role and just flat out the most powerful utility, period. Things that are capable of doing really unique things that other roles cannot do, and very powerful things that other roles cannot do. Now, even in spite of that, though, a decent amount of the support's impact, whether it's healing or utility, directly relies on other people, at the very least, fulfilling their jobs. I would say, unlike how a DPS player can completely take over a lobby on the high end, a support cannot do that in the same way. While you could often say someone needs to shut down that DPS, they're destroying this lobby, you're not going to say that nearly as much for a support. That being said, though, those games are still anomalies, and most games are a balance, an exchange of resources with both sides where both teams are fulfilling the majority of their jobs, at least at a base level. And especially in a game where a tank is fulfilling their core job and not perma-inting, supports feel higher average impact than DPS. This is because a huge amount of the support's impact is tied to how the tank is doing and what the tank is doing, while a DPS's impact is less impacted by what the tank is doing. So this means that a big part of the support's value comes at the whim of other people, but when those people are doing well, it combines with the support's impact to be a high grade or average. This is why I firmly believe that the better other roles are doing their jobs, the better and more impactful a support's impact feels. This is why a tank could go into a game, feel like a punching bag, but in that act is actually doing their job incredibly well, and the supports get to be very impactful because they are willing to be the punching bag for their team. So the tank is being essential and enabling the support to be impactful, but at the same time feeling incredibly weak, but also allowing their supports to be incredibly strong. Now, on the flip side, though, the less your other roles do, the worse and worse support feels. And you can feel very, very weak on a support if you have DPS that are not contesting other DPS, and you have tanks that are not doing their fundamental jobs. I also don't believe that you can carry a lot of games from absolute brink in the same way that you can create something from nothing like a DPS. A lot of your value is tied to other people, so when you're starting from zero, unlike the DPS role that can make some magic happen from zero, like a Tracer can go in and make some value happen, or a Hanzo can get a one-shot, or a Widow can pop off, supports have trouble making things from zero, but they have a much better job at amplifying the impact that people on their team are getting. So now that we've gone through it all, what is the real answer? Which role is the strongest in Overwatch 2? And I really do think it comes down to the game itself. Like, in certain games, a DPS can absolutely take over a lobby, especially when there's one DPS that is incredibly overperforming and there's two other DPS on the enemy team that do not have the capability to deny that DPS value. In that game, that DPS will feel incredibly strong and probably the strongest. But in other games, a tank can completely take over a lobby, running it down, killing everyone on Doom. And in other games, the enemy team swap, counter, and shut him down very easily. But even in games where tanks don't feel very strong, I do think that they are incredibly essential, but that's because the burden is all on just one tank's shoulders. If you're not a tank player and you have trouble understanding this, imagine as a support, you only had one instead of two. Speaking of support, They have the strongest utility, so are they the strongest individual heroes? Well, they can be, in my opinion, but they need their team to be performing well, and the better their team are doing their jobs, the more and more impactful supports feel. And I also think this is one of the reasons why in the very high ranks of play, supports can feel like the most impactful, but in the vast majority of ranks, supports can feel very weak at times, and in fact, I would say it's 50-50 whether they feel weak or strong. Now, the true answer to the question is that it's just purely subjective. And yeah, I understand, this is kind of a cop-out answer, but imagine telling someone, hey, the support role is the most impactful, while they simultaneously just left a lobby where the enemy freaking Hanzo went like 40-1. Or try telling a player that the tank role is the most impactful, while they just came out of a game where they were perma-discoordinated and slept the entire game, and they felt like they couldn't do anything at all. Now, regardless of who you think is the strongest, it's important for you to just do as best you can in the games you're given, trying to fulfill whatever you need to, while at the same time trying to find ways to find as much value as you can, even if your team is unwilling or unable to help you at all. Now, regardless though, I said my piece, so I want to pass the question off to you. How do you feel about the balance between each role? Which role do you think is the strongest, or do you think it doesn't matter? Let me know why or why not in the comments down below, and smash that like, subscribe if you enjoy the content. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.